Alrighty, now we're gonna end off the lesson with a quick whirligig tour of the other sorts of things we can do with lists. Let's start by reviewing what we've already seen we can do. We know we can get the number of elements in a list using the len function. We can use the append function to insert something at the end of the list, and we can use the pop function to remove something from the end of a list and return that. So let's talk now about what else we can do with lists. The first thing we can do that's kind of helpful is check whether a list is empty. Over here, you'll notice that we've got my list equal to 42. It does have an element in it. And on the right, it's equal to an empty list. It doesn't have anything inside it. And so you'll notice what I'm doing over here is something a little bit strange. I'm just saying if my list. Usually what we do in if statements is we have a boolean over here. We do something like if 42 in my list. But it turns out you can use lists themselves as conditions. This is a little odd to look at, but essentially what it's doing is it's saying, is this list empty or does it have elements? If it has elements, my list is considered true. If it doesn't have elements, my list is considered false. And so in this case, since there are elements, we print list has elements, and otherwise we print that the list is empty. All right, the next thing we can do is remove elements in other creative ways. For example, over here, we've got my list equal to 42, 110. I can call pop again, but this time I can pass a parameter into pop. I'm passing 1, which refers to the index of the parameter I would like to remove. So in this particular case, I would like to remove the element at index 1 as opposed to the last element in the list. And so I remove 100, which is at index 0, 1, and removed is therefore equal to 100, the element I just removed from the list. Now the pop function always removes by index. It removes something at the end of the list or something at a particular position on the list. But sometimes what you might want to do is remove a value from a list rather than from a position at a list. So in this particular case, I've got my list equals 42, 110, 42, and I can call mylist.remove 42. Now what the remove function does is it removes the first instance of a value from the list. So you'll notice in this particular case, we removed the first 42 from the list, but not the second one. So we've still got 110, 42 down here. Okay, so there's a couple ways you can creatively remove elements from lists. Let's talk about the converse, how we can add elements to lists. So in this particular case, notice that both of these programs begin with two lists, my list and another, which in both cases are equal to 42, 110, and 2, 3, 4. The first function I'm going to tell you about is one called extend, which essentially takes all of the elements in one list, in this case another, and inserts them in my list. So what you'll notice is that once this code is executed, another is still going to be equal to 2, 3, 4, but my list is going to be its original value, 42, 110, as well as 2, 3, 4, which are the next ones over here. We've taken all the elements of another and we've appended them to my list over here. So the important detail over here is that this line of code modifies my list. So my list will have more elements afterwards than before. In this case over here, you'll notice it's not quite the same situation. We still have my list and another, but now rather than modifying my list, we're creating yet another list called combined, which is equal to my list plus another. And what that's going to do is it's going to make a new list over here, which is equal to the concatenated or combined result of these two lists over here. 42, 110, 2, 3, 4 down there. Alrighty, so that's the difference over here. The plus operator makes a new list, whereas the extend function modifies one of the lists. You can kind of combine these pieces of syntax slightly and say instead that my list plus equals another. That's just short forms for saying my list dot extend another. So you can replace this line of code with this one, which looks a little cleaner and perhaps more like what you're used to, and that'll work exactly the same way. Alrighty. Now, another thing you can do is start to get a little fun with indices in a list. So in this particular case, let's imagine that you're hunting for a particular element in a list. You want to say, I would like to know where 100 shows up in my list over here. You can use the mylist.index function, and what that's going to do is that's going to tell you the position of the first index of this value in the list. So you'll notice in this particular list, my list occurs twice, 100 over here and 100 over here. But when we call index of 100, we get back 1 over here because that is the first element in this list over here and the fourth position of 100. So we totally forgot about this 100 over here. We only got back the position of this one over here. And finally, we've got the insert function over here. What that does is it says insert an element to this list, but unlike append, which is always going to stick an element at the very end of the list, this function allows you to tell the program where you want your new element to go. So in this case, we would like to insert the number 27 at index 1 of this list. And so you'll see the output over here has 27 at index 1, and we've shifted all of the other elements down. So 100 is now at index 2 and 10 is at index 3. There's a few other helpful functions that you might find useful in the future. There's a function called max, into which you can pass a list and you get back the largest number of the list, 250. There's a function called min, into which you can pass a list and get back -7. That's the smallest element on the list. And finally, there's a function called sum, into which you pass a list and get back the sum of all of the elements in that list. So just adding all these together. You'll also notice that sum is actually the same as that add many numbers function I showed you a little earlier on in the lesson, and that was intentional. You now know under the hood how a function like this would actually work. It would just go through each of the elements in this list one by one and accumulate them into an accumulator variable and return that variable. So there's a bunch of things you can do with lists. This section, I showed you a few of them, certainly not an exhaustive list, but I think we've covered all of the ones you would most commonly use in your programs. I'm really excited now to see what you do with these tools, and this week's section and assignments are going to be making use of these tools. I also recommend you think about how you can slot them into your creative projects. In the next video, I'm going to take you through a quick worked example of how a list can be used for a slightly more complex problem. But other than that, we're done with the substantive content for this week's lesson. Congratulations, and I'm excited to see what you can do with lists.